the freedom of letting go. Peace, compassion, and emotional mastery. You may have noticed how easily the mind returns to something that has already ended. A conversation from years ago can suddenly appear while you are driving, having dinner, or lying awake at night. Perhaps someone said something that hurt you, treated you unfairly, or betrayed a trust you once placed in them. The moment itself may have lasted only a few minutes, yet the mind can revisit it for years, adding words that were never spoken and imagining answers that came too late. There is something strange about this. The person may no longer be in your life. The circumstances may have completely changed, and yet the body can still react as though the encounter is happening now. The shoulders tighten, the breath becomes shallow, and an old feeling rises almost before you have realized what you are remembering. The mind tells the story again, not because anything new is being discovered, but because some part of us still believes that continuing the story might finally bring it to an end. The Buddha understood this movement of the human mind with remarkable clarity. He saw that suffering is not always sustained by the original event. Sometimes it is sustained by our relationship with the memory of the event, by the resentment we repeatedly recreate, and by the belief that another act of hostility might somehow resolve the first one. An ancient story connected with the Buddha's teaching presents this pattern through two people whose hatred continued across different lives. Their circumstances changed, their bodies changed, but the conflict remained. Eventually, they were brought before the Buddha, who showed them what they had been unable to see while they were trapped inside their anger. The story is ancient. The mind it describes is not. The old conflict. The story of Kalyakini begins with a householder whose wife was barren. He later took another wife, and the presence of the younger woman created jealousy and fear in the elder wife. The younger woman became pregnant, and the elder wife caused the pregnancy to be lost. The younger woman eventually died in childbirth. According to the story, their hostility did not end with death. They were reborn repeatedly, taking different forms, first as a hen and a cat, then as a doe and a leopardess, and finally as a nobleman's daughter and an ogress named Kalyakini. In each existence, the circumstances changed, but the hostility continued. Eventually, Kalyakini pursued the woman who was carrying her baby. The woman fled to Jetavana, where the Buddha was giving a discourse, and placed her child at his feet for protection. Kalyakini was prevented from entering at first, but the Buddha later called her in. He did not simply condemn one and defend the other. Instead, he revealed the history of their conflict and showed them how each injury had become the cause of another. They had been carrying the same hostility through changing circumstances, never reaching an end because every response became another beginning. Then the Buddha spoke the words preserved in Dhammapada verse 5. Hatred is never appeased by hatred. It is appeased only by loving kindness. This is an ancient law. The wisdom of the story is not only in what happened to these two women. It is in the pattern they could not see. Hatred had become self-perpetuating. Each believed that the next response was justified by what had happened before. And so the conflict had no natural place to stop. That same pattern can appear in much quieter forms in our own lives. The fire that continues. Someone speaks harshly to you, and you answer with equal sharpness. They become defensive, and their defensiveness confirms your belief that they are unreasonable. You become more certain that your response was justified, while they become equally certain that yours was the original aggression. Within minutes, neither person is responding simply to what happened. Each is responding to the reaction of the other. This is how conflict begins to feed itself. The interesting thing is that neither person usually feels like the aggressor. Each feels like the injured party. Anger arrives with a convincing explanation. You were disrespected. You were ignored. You were betrayed. You were treated unfairly. The mind does not present resentment as a burden. It presents it as a form of justice. But after the anger has been carried for an hour, a day, or several years, another question becomes possible. What has this anger actually given you? The original event may have been real and painful, but replaying it does not change it. Imagining a better response does not alter the conversation. Mentally defeating the other person does not restore the peace that existed before the conflict. Sometimes the mind confuses remembering with resolving. It keeps returning because returning feels like action. Yet the wound may not be receiving understanding. It may simply be receiving attention. When memory becomes a habit, a painful experience can gradually become more than a memory. It can become a habit of perception. Once someone has disappointed you deeply, you may begin expecting disappointment from them. A neutral expression looks hostile. Silence feels deliberate. A disagreement becomes proof of bad intention. You begin noticing everything that confirms the old story, often without realizing that you are doing it. The mind learns through repetition. This is why changing the outside world does not always settle an inner conflict. You can leave a workplace, in a relationship, move somewhere else, or stop speaking to a particular person, and still find yourself carrying the same emotional pattern into the next chapter of life. The scenery changes, but the mind may bring the old weather with it. This does not mean that external circumstances do not matter. Sometimes distance is necessary. Sometimes a relationship should end. Sometimes a boundary must be established. Understanding the mind does not mean tolerating harmful behavior. It means noticing the difference between protecting yourself and continuing to poison yourself with resentment. The moment of seeing. When anger is strong, attention naturally moves outward. What did they do? Why did they do it? How could they behave that way? What should happen to them now? Awareness asks a quieter question. What is happening inside me? Perhaps you notice the tightening in your shoulders. Perhaps your breathing has changed. Perhaps the same sentence is repeating in your mind. Perhaps you are preparing an argument with someone who is not even present. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because you are no longer completely inside the story. You are watching it. The anger may still be there, but now something else is present alongside it. There is awareness of anger. That small distinction creates space. You do not have to force the emotion away. You do not have to tell yourself that you should not feel hurt. You simply begin to see the movement before automatically following it. A thought can arise without becoming an action. An emotion can be felt without becoming a weapon. And sometimes that is where change begins. The current beneath the mind. Think of a river after heavy rain. The water moves quickly, carrying leaves and branches with it. If you step into the current, you are carried along by its force. But if you stand beside the river, you can watch the same movement without being swept away by it. The mind has currents too. A memory touches an insecurity. The insecurity produces fear. Fear creates defensiveness. Defensiveness produces anger, and anger produces another thought that appears to confirm the original fear. The entire sequence can happen so quickly that we experience it simply as being angry. But careful observation reveals movement beneath the emotion. And once you see the movement, something changes. You no longer have to believe that every impulse deserves completion. The river does not need to be stopped. You do not have to control every thought. You simply become less willing to enter the current unconsciously. This is why awareness can soften suffering without forcing anything to disappear. You are not fighting the mind. You are becoming familiar with it. The strength of not returning. There is a quiet strength in refusing to return hatred with hatred. It can feel unnatural because the mind wants balance. If someone humiliates you, you want them to feel humiliated. If someone ignores you, you may want them to experience the same rejection. If someone hurts you, some part of you wants the pain to travel back to its source. It can feel like justice. But sometimes what we call balance is simply retaliation wearing a respectable name. Not returning hatred does not make you passive. You can speak firmly, establish boundaries, leave a relationship, refuse cooperation, or take appropriate action when someone has caused harm. None of these things require hatred. There is a difference between acting because clarity requires action and acting because anger demands an outlet. The first can be firm without being cruel. The second often creates another wound. And then the new wound becomes the reason for another response. The cycle continues. Seeing the person again. Hatred has a way of simplifying another human being. Someone becomes the selfish person, the dishonest person, the arrogant person, the one who ruined everything. Once the label is fixed, it becomes easier to remain angry because we are no longer encountering a complicated human being. We are encountering a category. Awareness can loosen that certainty. Perhaps the person acted from fear. Perhaps they were protecting an insecurity. Perhaps they were repeating something they had learned long before they met you. None of this excuses harmful behavior, and understanding does not require reconciliation. It simply means that you can recognize another person's humanity without approving of what they did. This is an important distinction. You do not have to call harmful behavior acceptable in order to stop carrying hatred toward the person who caused it. You can know that something was wrong and still refuse to make that wrong the center of your inner life. Perhaps loving kindness begins here, not as affection, but as the willingness to stop reducing another human being to their worst moment. The modern return. Our lives now contain countless ways to keep old conflicts alive. A relationship can end physically while remaining present through messages, photographs, social media, and the quiet temptation to check what the other person is doing. Sometimes we tell ourselves that we are only curious, but curiosity can become another way of returning. The mind touches the wound to see whether it still hurts, discovers that it does, and then returns again later. Nothing dramatic happens, it simply becomes a habit. Awareness can interrupt this without creating another struggle. You notice the impulse to check, you notice the curiosity. You recognize where the movement leads. Perhaps you choose not to follow it. That may seem insignificant, but a pattern does not need a dramatic ending. Sometimes it ends because one repetition does not happen. Loving kindness without pretending. The Buddha's use of loving kindness can sound difficult when we think about serious hurt. It may seem to ask us to feel affection towards someone who harmed us. It does not have to mean that. Sometimes loving kindness begins by refusing to add another injury. You can acknowledge, "This hurt me," without continuing with, "Therefore I must carry this pain indefinitely." You can maintain distance without maintaining hatred. You can decide that someone no longer belongs in your life without allowing them to occupy your mind every day. You do not have to trust again. You do not have to forget. You do not have to reconcile. You can simply stop feeding the fire. Perhaps this is one of the most practical meanings of the ancient verse. Hatred is not defeated by making yourself feel loving. It is weakened when you stop giving it the conditions it needs to continue. Understanding instead of forcing. There is a difference between knowing that resentment is harmful and seeing it directly in your own experience. You may have heard many times that anger is exhausting, that forgiveness is healthy, or that holding grudges hurts the person who holds them. These statements can be intellectually true without changing anything. Something deeper happens when you observe your own mind. You notice how much energy is spent maintaining an argument with someone who is not present. You notice how your body changes when the memory returns. You notice how the mind searches for evidence supporting its version of the story. You begin to see that remembering is not always passive. Sometimes remembering is a fresh act of reconstruction. And then understanding becomes experiential. No one has to convince you. You have seen what the pattern costs. That kind of understanding does not feel like another instruction added to your life. It feels like something you no longer need to be told. The place where it can stop. Every cycle has a point where it can continue or stop. It is not always possible to prevent the first emotion. Anger may already be present. The thought may already have appeared. Your body may already be tense. But there is usually a moment before the next action. Perhaps it is the moment before you send the message. Perhaps it is the moment before you speak. Perhaps it is the moment when you realize that you have been rehearsing the same argument for the last 20 minutes. You do not have to become peaceful in that moment. You only have to see it. That pause can reveal something important. An impulse is not an instruction. A thought does not have to become a decision. An emotion does not have to become behavior. The old current may still be moving, but you are no longer adding yourself to its momentum. Beyond forgiveness. Perhaps you have been waiting to forgive someone before allowing yourself to feel free. But forgiveness can become another form of attachment when we turn it into a task that must be completed. There may be another possibility. You stop organizing your inner life around the person. You stop waiting for an apology before permitting yourself to live fully. You stop checking whether they regret what they did. You stop requiring them to understand your pain before you allow some of that pain to become lighter. The past remains part of your story, but it no longer needs to remain the center of your attention. This is not forgetting. It is not saying that what happened did not matter. It is allowing what happened to occupy the place it actually belongs. The past. An event can remain significant without remaining alive. The open hand. Imagine carrying a stone in your hand for many years because someone once threw it at you. At first, holding it feels like remembering. Later, it feels like protection. Eventually, you may forget that you are holding anything at all. You simply move through life with a closed hand. Then one day you notice the stone. The person who threw it is no longer standing in front of you. The danger has passed. The stone is no longer protecting you. You are simply accustomed to carrying it. No one needs to tell you what the stone means. You see it. And once you see it clearly, you can open your hand. This is sometimes what freedom feels like. Not victory, not defeat, not some dramatic resolution of the past, but the simple recognition that you have been carrying something long after the moment that created it has ended. You do not have to throw the stone back. You do not even have to throw it away. You can simply stop holding it. A quieter freedom. The story of Kalyakini is dramatic, but the pattern it reveals is close to ordinary human experience. A hurt becomes resentment. Resentment becomes memory. Memory becomes identity. Identity demands defense, and defense creates another wound. The new wound then becomes the reason to continue. The Buddha's response was not another weapon. It was understanding. Hatred cannot end hatred because hatred belongs to the same movement that created the conflict. Returning it simply gives the movement another turn. Something different must enter the pattern. Perhaps it begins with one quiet observation. You notice the anger. You notice the familiar thought. You notice the impulse to reopen the argument, send the message, check the person's life, or construct one more explanation for why they behaved as they did. And instead of immediately following the movement, you remain present. The feeling is still there. The history is still there. But you are here. That distinction may be small, but sometimes an entire relationship with the past begins to change inside such a small space. The old anger may return tomorrow. The old memory may appear again. That does not mean you have failed. The mind has habits, and habits can return. What changes is that you recognize them. You know where the current leads, and you become less willing to enter it without seeing. Perhaps freedom is not getting life to become exactly what you want. Perhaps it is no longer requiring reality to change before the mind can become peaceful. You cannot rewrite yesterday. You cannot make another person become the person you wanted them to be. You cannot recover every lost opportunity or erase every painful memory. But you can stop carrying yesterday into every tomorrow. And perhaps that is what the ancient verse is quietly pointing toward. Hatred does not end through more hatred. The fire does not become cool because another flame is added. Something different must enter: understanding, goodwill, and the willingness to stop. Not because the other person has earned your peace, but because your peace does not need to remain hostage to what happened. The women in the ancient story carried their conflict through changing forms until the pattern itself was finally brought into awareness. The ending came not through victory, but through seeing. Perhaps that is where freedom often begins. Not when the past has been defeated, but when it no longer needs to be continued. So when an old conversation returns tonight, you do not have to push it away. You do not have to force yourself to forgive. You do not have to pretend that it did not hurt. You might simply notice the tightening in your shoulders, the change in your breathing, and the familiar sentence beginning once again. Then remain there for one quiet breath. The past is there. The feeling is there. But you are here. And sometimes that is enough for the current to begin losing its force. Peace does not always arrive because the past has been solved. Sometimes it arrives because the mind has finally stopped carrying the past forward. There is nothing left to prove, nothing left to return, and nothing left that must be defeated. Only the possibility of opening the hand, allowing the current to move without entering it. Remembering without reopening the wound, understanding without excusing, and protecting yourself without poisoning yourself. Perhaps, very quietly, you discover that freedom was never waiting for the other person to change. It was waiting for you to see clearly what hatred was doing inside you. And once it is seen clearly, it no longer has to be continued. This is Buddha Reflections, where philosophy, insight, and lived experience meet to explore mind, impermanence, and release. Thanks for your time. It's been a delight. What should we explore next? Comment, share, and save your insight. Subscribe to Orbital Dharma and keep your thoughts bright.